Howdy, howdy, Chris here, and welcome back to Garage Noise. Today, we're going to prep out this primer for paint. I'm going to share with you some tips and tricks on how to correct some pinholes and any waves that you might have in your repair after you primer it. All that on today's episode, so let's get in the garage and make some noise. Okay, so in the last episode, we went ahead and straighten this dent. We got it in primer. Now what we need to do is we need to block this primer, make sure it's straight, make sure our body line looks good, make sure our bumper fits up properly, and then we'll prep out this fender for paint. I'm going to apply some charcoal guide coat over this, and we'll block sand this with a flexible block for this contour, and we'll do that with some 320 grit sandpaper, and then we'll want to go over it with 600 before we go ahead and paint it. Okay, so we just have a little bit of dry guide coat here. This is made by Duragold. We're going to apply this. This is going to show us any low areas. It's also going to show us when we have the texture removed from our primer. We want a nice smooth primer before we start applying our base coat. So we'll just spread this on over the primered areas. Just a thin coat. Now what we have here is I have a flexible block here with some 320 grit sandpaper. The only reason I'm using this flexible block is because of these contours. We'll block this kind of in an X pattern as best we can. Now this area we can block flat. I'm just going to block this in an X pattern with the contours of the body. Now once we get this smoothed out with this 320, it just cuts a little bit easier with 320 rather than 600. Then we'll be able to go over this just with an orbital sander and some 600 on an interface pad to smooth all these 320 grit scratches out. And a lot of these newer style vehicles have contours like this, so you need to get good at being able to block these out. Okay, so we found a little low spot here. You can see where the guide coat still is. So we've got a small low spot here, and that's okay. This is why we're doing this. This is why we're blocking this, to find those low areas that we might have missed. That's the reason why we use guide coat. So I'm gonna put a skim coat of USC Icing. It's a polyester glazing putty. Just a skim coat, very thin over that area just to block it out straight. I don't want to put another coat of primer over this because it's a little bit much for primer, so we need a little thin coat. We also have a couple little pinholes that I saw right here. There's one. We need to fill that, and we're going to wash this and take a good look at it before we apply the icing. So we'll get a good look at this. Okay, yeah, just a little thin pinhole there. Everything else looks pretty good. I might put another thin coat right there since we have still have a little flat spot there. I'm not gonna get crazy with it. All right, let's mix up some icing. We've got some USC icing here. We're gonna fold it in until it's all one uniform color, press it out so it's nice and smooth and there's no streaks. I've got a little extra hardener in here. Clean both sides of my spreader so I make sure I get all the unmixed glaze stirred in or mixed in. Okay, so I'm gonna get a little bit on my spreader here. I'm gonna start with actually this low area right here. So what I'm gonna do is just put it on my panel like that and then press it in. I'm spreading it over a larger area so we can gradually take out that wave with a thin coat, you know. Put a little bit more in. Get it nice and smooth. Okay, now I'm gonna put a little bit here as well. I think I'm gonna go this way. And I'm not putting a lot of pressure on this because I want to fill that little flat spot So there's a little flat spot right there. And you would probably never see that flat spot, but I don't want to take the chance. Since I'm already putting down some glaze, we'll just lay a little in here to be safe. Okay, we'll let that cure up. Then just a light sanding with some 180, then 320. And I'm gonna spray another coat, a thin coat of primer surfacer over this. Not a thick coat of primer, a thin coat. Will reduce it 4 to 1 to 2, and then we'll spray a thin coat over this just to basically seal it, get it all one uniform color, protect it, and then when we go ahead and spray it, we'll have a nice substrate to apply our base coat to. But while we're waiting for this icing to cure, we're gonna go ahead and sand the rest of this fender. I'll wipe it down, and then I'll sand it with 600 grit sandpaper, either on my orbital sander, or I might use a 600 grit foam pad because it's a small area. I might just do it all by hand. We'll tape up the edges so we don't hit any of these edges along this door. We don't want to hit any of the adjacent panels. We just want to scuff up the surface so the new paint and clear coat adhere properly. Okay, so I'm just going to just quickly run some tape down these edges just to protect this door a little bit. What I'm going to use to sand this is this super fine foam pad. This is made by, I forgot the company, but I'll leave the link in the description. I think it's Sunmite. It's 180 grit, but it leaves a 600 grit scratch. So that's a fine enough scratch that we can paint and clear over it. Now, I'm probably going to run over this with some 800 before we go ahead and lay down our base and our paint. But I just want to get the initial scuffing done with this foam pad, and it just makes it easy. You don't want to sand, even with this foam pad, you don't want to sand really hard on these edges so you can burn through. And we don't want to get any color back here because we're going to blend this even though it is very close to this door. Okay, now this is prepped and ready. We'll go over it with 800 once we get this all blocked out. I'm going to go over this with 800. This is the interface pad we're going to use. See, this is just a foam pad. It softens when you're sanding, so it moves with the contours of the panel, helps to sand it better, get it all nice and uniform. So this is just hook and loop, so basically Velcro. We're going to line up the holes here. Now when you're using a orbital sander, you want to hold it flat if you can. You don't want to sand, push hard on any contours. You can create a flat spot. So you want to move with the contours of the panel. This is 800 grit sandpaper. This is going to refine those scratches, just make it a little bit smoother when we apply our base. Now, normally I just go over it with 600 and that's perfectly fine. Wow. Okay, let's go ahead and block this filler now. Okay, we're going to block this icing with the 180 grit sandpaper. I'm using that flexible block so it can form to that contour of that fender. I'll add a little guide coat to help us identify when those lows have disappeared. One thing to mention here, I'm blocking down to that body line, and then when I block that flat area of the lip, I'll block up to it. That'll keep our body line in shape so we don't have any distortion in that. You can see how the low area is right there. We're going to block it out. All right, now we have that filled. We'll put a thin coat of primer over this and do the process over again. Sand it with 320, sand it with 600. We now have our fender prepped, and then we'll be able to mask it off for paint. Okay, we got 2K urethane primer. This is the upol mixed up 4 to 1 to 1. So it's a primer surfacer. So we're going to spray this with very low air pressure so there's not a lot of overspray. We're gonna spray it at about probably 15 PSI. I'm not gonna pull the trigger all the way. I'll feather the trigger and I'll narrow the fan pattern as well. Okay, that's the first coat. We'll let it flash off. I will put one more coat on this, and then all we'll have to do is lightly sand this with 600 to smooth it out. I'm now ready to get this fender sanded and prepped for paint. We've got our 2 coats of primer surfacer over it. We're gonna sand this with the 600 grit sandpaper on this foam interface pad so you can see how this is flexible. It's gonna smooth it out, and that's what we're looking for. And then we'll be able to mask this off and get ready to spray it. In the next episode, we'll be painting and clearing this fender and bumper cover. I've got some great information for you on how to do a tight blend and how to apply a silky smooth base coat finish. We'll also talk about gun settings for your clear coat and give you some tips and techniques to get a glass-like finish. Don't miss it. Make sure your notifications are turned on. Listen, I appreciate each and every one of you watching, and we'll see you next time on Garage Noise.